I was 60 years old when I realized that a person can love someone completely and still be treated like they are invisible. I was 60 years old, standing in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in October, holding my phone against my ear, listening to my son Marcus tell me that he had gotten married the day before. Not that he was getting married, not that he wanted to talk about wedding plans, that he had already done it. Yesterday, without me, without a phone call beforehand, without a text, without even a warning that would have given me the chance to prepare my heart for what was coming. Just a voice on the phone, my son's voice. The same voice I had heard for the first time 32 years ago, when he cried in the delivery room and the doctor placed him on my chest. That voice now saying the words, "Mom, we got married yesterday." And the world went very, very quiet. I want you to understand something before this story goes any further. I am not a dramatic woman. I was a school teacher for 31 years, middle school English, which means I spent 3 decades managing 12 and 13-year-olds. Which means I learned early and permanently that drama solves nothing and composure solves almost everything. I am the woman who stayed calm when Marcus broke his arm at age 9, and I drove him to the emergency room talking about baseball the whole way so he wouldn't panic. I am the woman who sat through a parent conference where a father screamed at me for 20 minutes, and I waited until he finished, and then calmly explained why his son had failed my class and what we were going to do about it. I do not fall apart. I do not perform. I have buried a husband and a sister and a best friend of 40 years, and I cried at every funeral, and then I went home and I got back up and I kept going because that is what you do. So when I tell you that what Marcus said to me on that October Sunday broke something open in me that I am still, to this day, working to repair, I need you to understand the weight of that. From me, from a woman like me, that means something. Marcus had been with Vanessa for 2 years and 4 months by the time he called with that news. I had known about her for almost all of that time because Marcus and I are close. We have always been close. In the particular way of a mother and a son who came through hard things together. His father, my husband Raymond, died when Marcus was 15. A heart attack, sudden and complete, on a Tuesday morning in March. Raymond left for work and never came back, and Marcus and I spent the following years rebuilding our world without him. Just the two of us, learning how to be a family of 2, when everything in us was still oriented toward 3. That kind of loss either pulls people apart or welds them together, and what it did to us was weld. Not in an unhealthy way. I have always been careful about that, always made sure that Marcus had room to grow and separate and build his own life. But, in the way where you know someone down to the bone. In the way where you can tell from the sound of, hello, what kind of day they've had. In the way where there are no real secrets. Not because you've demanded that, but because the love between you is deep enough that secrets feel unnecessary. Or so I had believed. I met Vanessa on a Thursday evening in January, about 3 weeks after Marcus first mentioned her name. He had called me on a Sunday. Sundays have always been our day to talk, a habit we established when he went to college and have maintained ever since. And he said, "Mom, I need to tell you about someone." And the way he said it, the particular softness in his voice and the way he paused before, someone told me everything I needed to know before he said another word. I asked him to tell me and he did. Her name was Vanessa. She was a graphic designer. She had grown up in Atlanta, moved here 5 years ago. She was 34. She had a younger sister. She made, according to Marcus, the most incredible jerk chicken he had ever tasted in his life. Which made me smile despite the complicated feelings beginning to arrange themselves inside me. Because I had made jerk chicken for that boy since he was old enough to eat solid food, and I was not entirely prepared to be displaced in that particular category. But I smiled, and I asked the right questions, and I listened. And when we hung up, I sat in my living room for a while and just breathed. A new person was entering the story. That is always a significant thing, whether you're 60 or 20, whether you're the mother or the child. A new person is always a new set of unknowns. She came to my home for the first time on that January Thursday. Marcus had suggested dinner at his apartment, but I had asked if I could host instead. Because I am someone who thinks more clearly on my own ground, and because a meal that I have cooked tells people something about me that I think is worth communicating early. I made roast chicken and sweet potatoes and a salad with a dressing I learned from my mother, who learned it from hers. I set the table properly, with the good napkins. I put flowers in a small vase because flowers say welcome without making a statement. I was ready an hour early, and then I sat in my kitchen and told myself to breathe and be open. To see her clearly, rather than through the lens of what I was hoping or fearing. When they arrived, she was wearing a burgundy sweater and small gold earrings, and she walked through my door and said, "Mrs. Coleman, your home is absolutely beautiful." And she said it while looking around at my walls and my bookshelves and my photographs with what seemed like genuine interest, and I thought, okay, let's see who you are. The dinner was better than I had expected, which is an honest thing to say. Vanessa was warm and easy to talk to, and she looked at Marcus the way a woman looks at a man when she sees him clearly and is glad about what she sees. She asked about my teaching career with real curiosity and listened to the answers. She told me about her work with the kind of specific passion that makes you understand someone values what they do. She laughed easily, and she didn't try too hard to impress me, which is the most effective way to impress me. By the time they left and I was washing dishes in my quiet kitchen, I was smiling. I called my sister Diane the next morning and said, "She's good. I think she might actually be good." Diane said, "Careful, that's almost a compliment," and I said, "That's exactly what it is." The months that followed were good months, mostly. I saw Vanessa regularly. Family dinners, holidays, the kind of consistent small gatherings through which you actually come to know a person over time. I liked what I saw. But there were things that gave me pause, small things that I noted without quite knowing what to do with them. The way she steered conversations away from her family whenever they came up naturally. The way the wedding never became a topic. Even after 18 months of dating, even after Marcus had, I was fairly certain, begun thinking about proposing. Once, watching a wedding scene in a movie we were all watching together, she made a small comment about how she couldn't imagine a big event like that, how exhausting it seemed, and then she changed the subject so smoothly, I nearly missed that she'd done it. I filed these things away. I told myself they were nothing. I told myself that not everyone has the same relationship with formal occasions, and that was perfectly reasonable, and was none of my business. I told myself this so many times and so firmly that I almost believed it. Then Marcus proposed. He called me the night before, which was the kind of gesture that still makes my eyes sting when I think about it. Because he didn't have to do that, and the fact that he did told me everything about who my son is at his core. He said, "Mom, I'm asking her tomorrow. I wanted you to know first." And I asked him, "Are you sure, baby?" Not because I doubted his love for her, because I wanted to hear him say it, and he said, "I have never been this sure of anything." So I said, "What you say when your child's certainty is pure and visible and real." I said, "Then go ask her, and Marcus, she's lucky, make sure she knows it." He laughed and said goodnight. And I sat with the bigness of it for a long time after we hung up, with the lamp on, and the house quiet, and my heart full of things that did not have simple names. She said yes. He called the next evening, and his voice was electric with happiness, the specific happiness that comes from having asked an enormous question and received exactly the answer you needed, and he put Vanessa on the phone and she said, "We're engaged." And I said everything right. I said congratulations, and I said I was so happy, and I said we needed to celebrate, and I meant all of it, even the parts that sat next to more complicated feelings. Because that is what love looks like when it is mature. It holds complexity without letting the complexity swallow the joy. I was happy for my son. I was also a 60-year-old woman whose only child had just become engaged to a woman whose family I had never met, whose past I only partially knew, and who had, on multiple occasions, made it quietly clear that she held certain things close and did not easily let people in. Both things were true simultaneously. I held them both. What I expected to happen after the engagement was what normally happens: conversations about dates, talk of venues, the slow emergence of a plan, a meeting with Vanessa's family, whom I had still, after 2 years, never met in person, only her mother briefly on a video call during the holidays. A pleasant but distracted woman who seemed to be participating in the call out of obligation rather than desire. I expected that the engagement would open doors that had been politely closed during the relationship. I expected to be, at minimum, included in the broad strokes of what was being planned for my son's wedding. I prepared myself to be patient and accommodating, and to follow their lead on what kind of ceremony they wanted, because that is what a good future mother-in-law does. I was prepared to be flexible. I was prepared to be gracious. What I was not prepared for was nothing. Not nothing from cruelty. I want to be precise about this. Not nothing from malice. But a specific, careful, deliberate nothing that kept me. And the idea of the wedding, at a permanent arm's length. When I asked about dates, Vanessa would smile and say they were still enjoying being engaged. When Marcus mentioned venues once, the subject changed by the time I could ask a follow-up question. When I offered, gently and once, to help with any planning she might want a second opinion on, she thanked me warmly and said she would let me know, and she never did. I watched months go by. I watched the engagement stretch from 3 months to 6 to 9 to a year. I began to understand, in the wordless way that you understand things you cannot prove, that whatever was being planned was not going to include me in any real way. But even then, even with that understanding sitting quietly in me like a stone at the bottom of a still pond, I did not imagine what actually happened. A year and 2 months after the engagement, on a Sunday in October, Marcus called me. It was mid-afternoon, which was slightly later than our usual Sunday calls, and his voice had a quality I recognized but couldn't immediately name, a fullness. A particular brightness with something underneath it. I said hello and asked how he was, and he said, "Mom, I have to tell you something." And those words, those exact words, the same words he had used 2 years earlier when he first told me about Vanessa, landed differently this time, and then he said it, something in me yesterday. Yesterday. The word went through me like cold water. Not today, not last week, yesterday. 24 hours ago. My son had stood in front of someone and made the most significant promise of his adult life, and I was finding out about it the following afternoon. I am 60 years old. I have had a lifetime of practice at managing what I feel in real time, at keeping my voice steady while my insides do what they need to do. So what I said was where, and he told me. A courthouse. Just the two of them and a witness. A friend of Vanessa's named Claudette, who I had heard mentioned twice. It had been what Vanessa wanted, he said. Small, private. Just between them, without the weight of family and expectation and occasion. He said it was beautiful. He said she had worn a cream-coloured dress, and he had gotten her flowers, and they had walked out into the October sunlight married, and it had felt exactly right. He said he hoped I understood. He said he loved me, and I said I was happy for him.
Give Vanessa my love. I said we would celebrate soon.
And I meant none of it, and I meant all of it. And after we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and I put my hands flat on the table that Marcus had eaten at 10,000 houses, and I let myself feel what I actually felt. I had been excluded, not accidentally. Not as a casualty of a small... The exclusion had been considered and planned and executed over many months, the long engagement, the deflected conversations about dates and venues. The careful way questions about the wedding had been steered around for over a year. It all came into focus now with a clarity that was almost physical. I had been excluded from my son's wedding with enough deliberateness that the exclusion required sustained effort to maintain, and the reason given, Vanessa needed it to be private. Without the pressure of family, was a reason I was going to have to sit with, because it had Marcus's fingerprints of accommodation all over it. His willingness to shape himself around what she needed, even when what she needed came at significant cost to someone he loved. I called my sister Diane that evening and I said, "Marcus got married yesterday." And the silence on her end told me she understood immediately what I had not said. She said, "Oh, Patricia, just that." And I said, "I know." And Diane, who has known me for 60 years and has never once told me what I wanted to hear at the expense of what I needed to hear, said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know yet. But I'm going to be very careful about it." Because that was the truth. This was the kind of situation where the wrong move could damage something irreparable. My son was married. He was happy, or performing happiness in the way he does when he wants the people he loves to not worry about him. And I was his mother, which meant my job was not to wound but to see clearly and to respond with the kind of wisdom that 60 years and one lifetime of hard lessons had, hopefully, given me access to. I did not call Marcus back that night. I gave him and Vanessa their first evening as a married couple without my feelings intruding on it. That was, I think, the right decision. I made myself tea, and I sat with the weight of things, and I let grief be grief without turning it into anger before I understood what I was actually dealing with. And what I understood, sitting there in my kitchen at 60 years old, was this. Not explicitly, not openly. But underneath all of it, underneath the exclusion and the explanation, and Marcus's careful, loving, apologetic tone on the phone, there was an ask. And the nature of that ask was going to become much clearer very soon.
22 days after my son's secret wedding, his new wife called me about rent. 22 days. I want you to hold that number, feel the specific weight of it. Because the distance between "we got married without telling you" and "can you transfer the rent money" was 22 days, and what lives inside that distance is the whole center of this story. It was a Tuesday. Vanessa called me directly, which was unusual enough that I noticed it before I even answered. We did not have a phone call relationship. We texted occasionally, usually in group threads that included Marcus, and we had our conversations face-to-face at family dinners. A direct call in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon was new. I answered, and she was warm and friendly, and we talked for a few minutes about ordinary things. The weather, a show I had mentioned liking, how I had been spending my time since I retired. And then, with a smoothness that I had to admire even as I recognized what it was, she moved into the real reason for the call. She said they had had an unexpected month financially. Marcus's car had needed a significant repair. There had been some costs associated with the wedding, the courthouse fees, the dinner they'd had afterward, Vanessa's dress, and the rent was due at the end of the week. She said she wanted to ask about the transfer, since Marcus had mentioned speaking to me about it. She said it in the exact tone of following up on an agreed thing, the tone of a reminder rather than a request. And I sat very still and I said, "I'm sorry, Vanessa. What transfer?" The pause that followed had a texture to it, a brief recalibration, barely audible, the sound of a story adjusting itself mid-telling, and then she said, "Oh, maybe I misunderstood. I thought Marcus had already spoken with you. Never mind. I'm sorry to bother you. I'll talk to him." And she laughed lightly, the way you laugh when you want to signal that something is casual and small, and we said goodbye and the call ended. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. Then I set it down on the table. Then I got up and made myself a cup of tea, which is what I do when I need to think. I stood at my stove, and I waited for the water to boil, and I turned the whole shape of the thing over in my mind. Vanessa had called me about money. Not Marcus, Vanessa. She had framed it as a follow-up to a conversation Marcus had supposedly had with me, a conversation that had never happened. Whether she genuinely believed Marcus had spoken to me and was confused, or whether she had constructed that framing deliberately as a way to make the request easier to make, I did not know. What I knew was the plain arithmetic of the situation. I had not been invited to my son's wedding on the grounds that family meant pressure and the occasion needed to be private. And 22 days later, that same family was being contacted for financial assistance. I called Marcus that evening. I kept my voice even and I told him exactly what had happened. Vanessa's call, what she had said, my response. I was not accusatory, I stated facts. And what happened on his end of the line was a silence that told me more than anything he could have said. A long silence, and then, "Mom, I didn't ask her to call you. I haven't spoken to you about any money," I said. "I know, Marcus." Another silence, and then he said, carefully, in the voice he uses when he is processing something difficult in real time, "I don't know why she told you that." And I said, "I think you need to find out," and he said he would. And we talked for a while longer about other things, because there is always a limit to how much of a hard thing you can hold in a single conversation, and then we said goodnight. What Marcus found out over the following days and weeks was not simple. The financial picture in his marriage was not what he had believed it to be. Vanessa managed their money. She was organized and decisive about it in a way that Marcus, who has always been something of an avoider when it comes to numbers and accounts and spreadsheets, found reassuring. He had been glad to hand it over. He had trusted her completely. But the trust had been misplaced, not catastrophically, not maliciously, but in the layered way that happens when a person has a complicated history with money and scarcity, and the management of both, a history that creates patterns of behavior that can operate independently of their conscious intentions. There were accounts Marcus hadn't known about. There were expenses that didn't match their explanations. The rent hadn't been late this month for the first time. It had been a recurring problem, quietly managed, quietly hidden. And somewhere in Vanessa's internal accounting of who could help solve the problem, she had arrived at me. And she had made the call. I want to say something carefully here, because I am telling you this story, and I am not a neutral party. And the truth deserves more than a one-sided telling. Vanessa is not a villain. I know that is not what you expected me to say, but it is what I believe, and I think it matters to say it plainly. She is a woman with a history. A childhood marked by financial instability, parents whose own relationship with money was chaotic and frightening. Years of adult life spent quietly hypervigilant about resources in a way that had calcified into habits she didn't fully see in herself. The secrets she kept from Marcus were not the secrets of a predator. They were of a person who had learned early that vulnerability about money leads to danger, and who had never fully unlearned that lesson even when she was safe. I understood this when I finally understood it. Not because I excused it, but because understanding is not the same as excusing, and I am not in the business of punishing people for their wounds. But here is also what is true. My son was hurting. My son, who had given this woman everything he had, including, most painfully to me, his willingness to exclude his own mother from his wedding so that she could feel safe and in control, was now discovering that the safety and control she had needed had been built on information he was not given. And I was his mother, which meant that even as I held compassion for Vanessa, I also held very firmly the needs of my son. These two things had to coexist, and holding them both at the same time was some of the hardest work I have done in my life. And then came the moment that this story has been building toward, the moment I think about now, when I want to understand who I am and what I believe and what I am willing to stand for. It came on a phone call. 2 weeks after the rent conversation, when Vanessa called me again. This call was different from the first one. She was less smooth, more direct, the careful framing stripped away by whatever had happened in the 2 weeks in between. She said they were still having difficulty this month. She said she knew it was a lot to ask. She said she would make sure it was paid back, and she said, I was hoping you could help with the rent. Didn't Marcus talk to you about it? And the word didn't. The assumption baked into that word, the expectation that the answer was probably yes, that I was already on board and this was just confirmation. That word did something to me. It unlocked something that had been waiting very patiently for the right key. Hi. I took one breath and I said quietly and clearly, with no anger in my voice, because anger was not what the moment required, Vanessa, I have a question for you. When you got married, when you and Marcus had that private ceremony that was just for the two of you, you said it was for special people only. Just you and Marcus, and your friend Claudette. Because family would have been too much pressure, too much of an occasion. Do you remember saying something like that? She was quiet. I continued. So I need you to tell me, if the wedding was only for special people, and I wasn't one of them, why is the rent my responsibility? The silence on the other end was complete, and into that silence, with the steadiness of a woman who has spent 60 years learning what she is worth and what she is willing to accept, I said, I think you should ask the special people.
I hung up the phone and I sat in my kitchen, and for the first time since October I felt completely like myself. Not triumphant, this was not a victory, because there are no victories in family pain, only degrees of honesty and degrees of cost. But clear. I felt clear. The kind of clear that only comes when you have finally said the true thing after a long time of holding it. Marcus called me that night. He had spoken to Vanessa. He knew what I had said. There was a pause when I answered. And then he said, Mom, just my name, just that. And I said, I know, baby. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I had not expected. He laughed. It was brief, and it surprised him as much as it surprised me, a short, helpless laugh, the kind that comes when the truth is so precise it almost hurts. And then the laugh became quiet, and he said, I've been thinking about things. And I said, I know. And he said, a lot of things. And I said, take your time. Because here is what I have learned about my son in 32 years. He does not process things quickly, but he processes them thoroughly. He does not arrive at understanding in a flash. He gets there slowly, carefully. The way you navigate a dark room, reaching out, feeling for walls, finding the shape of things through touch rather than sight. My job was not to rush him.
My job was to be the light he knew was on when he found his way to the door. What happened over the following months was not simple, and it was not resolved in one conversation or one gesture or one moment of grace. Marcus and Vanessa went through a hard season, genuinely hard. The kind of hard that involves professional help and long nights and conversations that leave both people exhausted and exposed. They worked with a therapist, together and separately. Vanessa was honest. Finally. About the financial picture and about the history that had created her patterns around it. Marcus was honest about the things he had allowed himself not to see because seeing them would have required him to do something difficult. There was pain. There was real damage to be assessed and repaired, and there were moments when I genuinely did not know what was going to happen, when the question of whether the marriage would survive its first year was an open question rather than a settled one. But they came through. Or they are coming through. I say it that way deliberately, because marriage is not a destination you arrive at, but a direction you keep choosing. What I can tell you is that they are still together, and that the relationship between all three of us has been rebuilt on a foundation that is more honest than the one it replaced. That honesty was paid for at a price that none of us would have chosen to pay, but it is real. And real is better than the alternative. Vanessa came to my house alone, one afternoon in the spring, about 6 months after the rent call. She called first to ask if she could come, which I appreciated. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, and she talked for a long time. She told me about her childhood, the apartment that was sometimes heated and sometimes wasn't, the mother who could be generous 1 month and mysteriously broke the next. The specific anxiety of a child who learned that financial security could disappear without warning, and that the adults around her were not always reliable guardians of it. She told me about why she had needed the wedding to be small, which was more complicated than I had understood at the time. She said she had grown up around family occasions that were supposed to be joyful, and almost always ended in revelation. Some hidden tension surfacing, some old wound reopened. Some damage that the gathering of people seemed to unlock. She had been so afraid of that happening with Marcus, of the most important day of their lives being contaminated by something uncontrollable, that she had pulled the whole thing close and shut out everything she couldn't predict, including me. Including the love I represented, which she had not known how to receive without also being afraid of it. I listened to all of this, and I believed her. I want to be clear. I believed that everything she told me was true, and I also said to her, gently but without flinching, what needed to be said. I told her that the impact of what she had done was real regardless of the intention behind it. I told her that I had missed my son's wedding, the only wedding my only child will ever have, and that there was no version of the future in which that day came back to me, in which I got to stand in a room with my son while he made his vows and see his face in that moment that was gone. She had to know I carried that. She nodded, and she did not make excuses. And she said she was sorry in the way that people say it when they mean it, and know that sorry is both necessary and insufficient. And I accepted it. Because that is what you do when you have decided that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. That moving forward is not the same as pretending the past didn't happen, but that moving forward is still always better than standing still in the wound. There is a Sunday now, every few weeks, when Marcus and Vanessa come to my house for dinner. We sit at the table that Marcus has been sitting at since he was old enough to climb into a chair, and we eat food I have made with my hands, and we talk about real things. Not everything. There are still things that take time to become safe to say they, but real things. Vanessa tells me about her work and her sister and her city. She asks about my students, the ones from 30 years of teaching whose paths I still sometimes hear about. She brought me flowers once, in the spring, yellow ones, because she had noticed I had yellow flowers in a photo on my wall and she had remembered. That was the moment I felt something genuinely shift. Not the flowers themselves, but the noticing. The fact that she looked at my wall and stored something she saw there and brought it back to me. That is not a nothing. That is a person trying. I can meet trying with trying. That is something I know how to do. My son is 32 years old and he is building a life. That life does not belong to me. It never did, not even when he was small and the whole world to him was the size of my arms. I have always known that a mother's job is not to hold on, but to make sure that when they let go, the person going is whole enough to find their own way. I hope I did that.
I believe mostly that I did. What I also know now, at 60. After everything this past year has shown me is that a mother's job is not finished when the child is grown. The job changes, it becomes less about protection and more about presence, less about guidance and more about witness. I am the witness to my son's life. I see him. I have seen him from the very beginning, and I will see him until I can't anymore. And the seeing is the love itself, the love made visible and daily and real, but witnessing does not mean silence. Witnessing does not mean that what I see has no significance, that what I feel has no weight, that I can be excluded from the most important moments and then called upon when I am useful. And this arrangement is something I must quietly accept because it is easier than the alternative. I am 60 years old. I taught children for 31 years how to respect themselves and others. I raised a son alone after losing his father, and I raised him well. I know that because I can see who he is, and who he is reflects the love that shaped him. I have earned my place in this story, not just as the woman who was wronged, but as the woman who stood up clearly and without cruelty and said, I know what I am worth, I know what was taken from me. And I know the difference between love and convenience. When Vanessa called me about the rent money and asked her I'd heard from Marcus, she was necessary to play a role, the soft, accommodating, endlessly available mother who absorbs whatever she is given and asks for nothing in return. That role has a long history. Many women in my position have played it. They play it because they love their children, because they fear being cut off, because the cost of speaking up seems higher than the cost of staying quiet. I understand all of those reasons. I have felt all of those fears, but I have also lived 60 years, and I have buried people I loved. And I have stood in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon and felt the full weight of what it means to have been left out of something I was owed, and I know this. The quiet has its own cost. The soft, accommodating silence has a price too. And at 60, I am no longer willing to pay it, so when she asked me if I had heard from Marcus about the money, I answered honestly. I said what was true. I said it without theatrics and without anger and without the desire to wound. I said it the way I hope I have always tried to say hard things, with the clarity of someone who has decided that love, real love, requires honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable, even when it costs you something, even when the person on the other end is not ready to hear it. Because here is what I know about the people we love. They can only grow into the truth if we are willing to speak it. We do them no favors by pretending. We do ourselves no favors by shrinking. The most loving thing I have done for Vanessa, more loving than any money I could have transferred, more loving than any silent accommodation I could have offered, was to hold a mirror up and let her see the shape of what she had done. That is the gift that nobody wants and almost everybody eventually needs. My son got married without me. That sentence is still there, still true, and I still carry it. I will probably carry it for the rest of my life, the way you carry the shape of something that was taken from you, not as an open wound, but as a fact that has been integrated into the story, part of the landscape rather than the whole of it. What I also carry is this: my son knows who I am. He knows what I stood for. He knows that I loved him enough to be honest with him and with his wife, even when honesty was hard, even when the easier thing would have been to write the check and say nothing, and let the whole complicated arrangement continue unexamined. He knows that when he needed someone in his corner who would see clearly and tell the truth, I was there. I am still there, I will always be there, because that is what mothers do, not the ones who simply absorb and accommodate, but the real ones. The ones who love you enough to cost you something, who show up even when they were not invited, and who tell you the truth even when a comfortable lie was available. That is the kind of mother I have tried to be. I hope it is the kind of mother I am. At 60 years old, sitting at my kitchen table with the flowers Marcus brought me last week still bright in their vase, I believe that it is.